The hissing of steam from the subway grates interrupted the silence of the evening. City lights cast long, menacing shadows over the pavement. Right in front of me, a missing child poster flapped in the breeze. It had been plastered over a lamppost, rain-washed, and barely clinging to it. I had seen that face before. Street vendors sold questionable food, with grease pooling in the grill tops. A thin wisp of smoke emanated from the cart, blending with the city fog. At that hour, only the brave or the foolish roam the streets. "I told you," a voice sneered, breaking me out of my reverie. I turned to see Marco, an old friend from high school. "Children go missing here every damn week." "And?" I glared. "And nothing," he laughed, taking a drag from his cigarette, the orange glow illuminating his face in a sinister dance. "Just stating the facts." I'd come back to the city after years abroad. Upon my return, the rumors had started. Whispers about children who'd vanished into thin air, never to return. The rumors were suffocating, and their impact on the community was palpable. "Third kid this month," a woman murmured to her friend as they hurried past, clutching their bags tighter, casting suspicious shadows at anyone who dared to make eye contact. "I heard it's a man," said a homeless guy, propped up against a brick wall, a tattered hat placed in front of him with meager coins. "Tall, wears a hat, stalks him, he does." Marco scoffed, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Urban legend. Every city's got one." "Then explain the disappearances," I retorted. He shrugged. "Maybe they ran away. Maybe it's a trafficking ring. Who knows? It's the city. Things happen." My fingers itched to slap the indifference from his face, but the seed of fear had been planted. I started seeing the missing children posters everywhere. Lampposts, bus stops, the mouths of alleyways. One evening, while walking through the park, I saw a group of kids playing. The setting sun cast a golden hue over their innocent faces, their laughter echoing, forming a dark contrast to the tales of horror that loomed large. In the distance, a silhouette stood watching, a man in a hat. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the figure melted away, almost as if he had never been there at all. The fear grew. Every time I'd heard a child's laughter, my heart would race. Every shadow, every whisper, every creak became a harbinger of doom. The nights were sleepless, the weight of a dark city, secrets that pressed down on me from everywhere. One night I was taking a shortcut through an alley, the familiar sound of children's laughter sending shivers down my spine. I strained my ears, trying to locate the source. It seemed to be coming from an old, dilapidated building, its windows boarded up, a relic from the long ago past. Against my better judgment, I approached, feeling an inexorable pull. As I neared the entrance, the laughter grew louder, more distinct, but eerily off somehow. It sounded distorted. The front door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway. From within, the giggles continued. My feet moved of their own accord, leading me deeper into that abyss. Each step echoed a rhythmic beat that only seemed to amplify the terror coursing through me. A dim light at the end of the hallway beckoned. The room it led to was bathed in an otherworldly glow. At the center stood a massive mirror, its ornate frame decorated with grotesque faces. The reflection, however, was not my own. Instead, the faces of the missing children stared back, their eyes hollow, their smiles twisted in eternal torment. "Help us," they whispered in unison. From the shadows, a tall figure emerged, the brim of his hat casting a shadow over his face. "Another one for my collection," he mused, his voice dripping with malevolence. I tried to move, tried to scream, to do anything, but my feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by an unseen force. As the figure approached, the room grew colder, the children's faces in the mirror growing more desperate. The man's hands reached out, inches from my face, and suddenly a blinding light filled the room, a cacophony of sound, sirens, shouts, the distant wails of a child. The spell was broken. I turned and ran, and never looked back. But the nightmare was far from over. I burst into the open night, gulping in the chill air, the neon city lights blurry through my tears. The horrifying vision in the building was imprinted on my mind. Those children, their faces warped with terror, the tall man reaching out for me. The sirens grew louder, reverberating through the empty streets, only to drown out when I stumbled into Marco, a concerned expression replacing his usual indifference. "What happened?" he panted, grabbing my shoulder. "I followed you when I saw you enter that building." But I could only point back to the cursed structure, my voice a mere whisper. "He's in there." Marco's eyes darted to the building, then back to me. Without a word, he pulled me away, ushering me towards the brighter parts of the city, away from the echoing laughter and the haunting shadows. We found ourselves in a 24-hour diner, the sterile fluorescent light seeming alien after the night's events. I narrated everything, and Marco listened intently, occasionally sipping his coffee. "You're lucky to have gotten away," he muttered, tapping his fingers nervously on the counter. "There are legends, you know, of the man in the hat. They say he traps souls, feeds on the innocent." "But why children?" My voice wavered, and the passing waitress shot me a worried glance. Marco sighed. "Children are pure, their energy's untainted. And urban areas, they're hunting grounds, filled with distractions, making them easy to prey on." Dawn approached as we decided to notify the police. Their skepticism was palpable, yet the consistent disappearances provided some weight to our story. They agreed to inspect the building. What they found sent shivers down my spine, and even the most seasoned officer was rattled a little. Inside that room was the mirror, the atmosphere thick, stifling. The walls were lined with old photographs, each displaying a missing child, their eyes vacant. In the center stood the grand mirror, but it was ordinary now, reflecting nothing but the grim faces of the officers. However, the most disturbing discovery was a room concealed behind thick drapes. Inside, a maze of strings connected pinned pictures, notes, bizarre symbols, each thread intertwined, leading to a single image in the center, a sketch of a man in a hat. Below it, a chilling note: "The city feeds, and so shall I." News spread like wildfire. The city was in an uproar. Vigilante groups formed, vowing to hunt down the man in the hat. Parents held their kids close, and the night saw the streets deserted. Weeks turned into months, but the city's palpable fear remained. The disappearances halted, but the memories persisted, a shadow over every home. One evening, as rain lashed the window panes, I received a call, an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. A raspy voice, dripping with malice, whispered, "You escaped me once, but the city never forgets." Frozen, I could only listen as soft, distorted laughter echoed in the background. I slammed the phone down, my heart pounding. The man in the hat wasn't done. The city's nightmare had only just begun. Despite the overwhelming dread, there was a determination that burned within me. I couldn't let this malevolent entity continue his reign of terror. Teaming up with Marco and a group of other survivors, we decided to delve deeper, to unearth the truth behind this urban legend. Our research led us to an ancient myth, stories of an entity that existed in the shadows, thriving on fear. The more that we feared, the stronger they became. Legends spoke of mirrors as portals, realms where these beings would trap souls, feasting on their essence. We needed to destroy the source of the power. We needed to destroy the accursed mirrors. Armed with tools and determination, we made our way to the building. The entrance seemed more foreboding than before, its dark void beckoning us, challenging us. Inside, the silence was oppressive. The mirror room awaited, the large glass surface reflecting our anxious faces. Taking a deep breath, I swung my sledgehammer. The impact sent ripples across the city. Every street, every home, every heart felt that first strike. As cracks appeared, the trapped souls began to break free. The city, once cloaked in darkness, began to breathe again. But it wasn't over yet. From the mirror's depths, the man in the hat emerged, his form more terrifying than any legend could convey. Our final battle had begun. The room's temperature plummeted. Our breaths were visible, forming vaporous clouds in the freezing air. The man in the hat moved with unnatural speed, a mere blur as he lunged at us. Marco and the others tried to restrain him, but it was like fighting a hurricane. His sheer force was overwhelming. His eyes were pools of infinite darkness locked onto mine, and I felt a pull, an overwhelming desire to succumb. Those eyes were a promise of peace, an end to constant dread, but beneath that, a current of benevolence lurked. "Join the others," he hissed, his voice echoing with the pain and sorrow of all his victims. But I wasn't ready to give up. Remembering the research, I shouted, "Don't look into his eyes! He draws strength from our fear!" Distracting him with makeshift weapons and tools, we circled the mirror, chanting an ancient spell we had discovered during our research. The room quaked, the very foundations of the building groaned under the force. The mirror's cracks began to grow, each fracture emitting a piercing scream, the collective voice of the trapped souls demanding release. The man in the hat, his strength waning, tried to retreat into the mirror, to escape the onslaught, but our chants grew louder, drowning out his anguished cries. With one final surge of energy, the mirror shattered, sending shards flying in all directions. The room was engulfed in blinding light, a force so potent it threw us back. As the light dimmed, we slowly got to our feet, taking in the aftermath. The man in the hat was gone. In his place was a pile of ashes and a worn-out hat lying on the floor, marking the end of that ancient terror. The walls, once lined with haunting photographs, now displayed blank frames, their tormented occupants finally free. Exhausted, we made our way out, the first rays of dawn painting the city in hues of hope. The streets, for the first time in months, echoed with genuine, joyful laughter. Children played without fear, families reunited, the weight of the dark past slowly faded away. News of our victory turned us into local heroes, but we knew the truth. The city's true heroes were its inhabitants, the collective spirit and hope being the real force that banished the evil. Yet, the city bore the scars, reminders of its tormented past. The once abandoned buildings became a memorial, dedicated to the lost souls, ensuring the city would never forget. Years went by, life moved on, but every now and again on quiet nights, when the city heartbeat slows, whispers rise, of a time when shadows held power, of brave souls who fought back, and of a man in a hat whose reign of terror is no more. However, urban legends have a way of persisting, tales passed down from generation to generation, and while the city had fought off one darkness, who's to say what other horrors lurked in its depths, just waiting for their time to rise? Teddy and I had been working at Disney for years. The two of us had seen hundreds, if not thousands, of young cast members come and go, heading off to college or to better jobs and brighter futures. Meanwhile, the two of us stuck around and became a running joke to some of the younger employees, since we were never promoted to management, that is. Most of the lower-level members were young, in their early 20s or late teens, and to them, it was just a part-time gig, a way to raise money for college or to pass a bit of time until their real lives and careers began. But Teddy and I were lifers, and some would say losers, although I would never attach that label to myself willingly. I'd heard it whispered enough times to know that it was what other people thought of us. We'd both been there for nearly 2 decades, and had worked on pretty much every single attraction, but had never been deemed responsible enough to be promoted to supervisor status. Over all that time, I found a lot of secrets about the place, some things that are known to the public, but also some revelations that aren't talked about anywhere. Did you know that cast members who work as mascots have to wear communal underwear? Yeah, that's right. They all share the same underoos, and they get washed in between uses. At least, in theory. Who knows what pervert came up with that idea? Or how about the fact the skeleton on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride was originally constructed out of real bones? Despite the park's insistence that all the bones were removed, a few still remain. Management lost track of which were real and which were fake, and they just left the real ones in there along with the imposters. But when you're up close, it's easy to tell them apart. The real ones are a little more yellow, and they're heavier than the plaster ones. There are plenty of morbid secrets like that. People scatter the ashes of their deceased loved ones in the park so frequently, we actually have a not-so-subtle code name for it. A white powder alert. The Haunted Mansion and the Pirates of the Caribbean are the most common places, but it's done all over. And who knows how often people get away with it without even being noticed. Code 101 means a ride is temporarily shut down, while Code V, or a protein spill, means that someone has vomited on a ride and it needs to be cleaned up. Those spills are often the cause of ride shutdowns, rather than mechanical issues. Oh, and if you hear yourself or someone else being referred to as a treasured guest, it doesn't mean you're a VIP. It's actually our code word for saying you're being an asshole. There are stories of ghosts, some told by people who never believed in such things before witnessing them in the park. The specter of Walt Disney himself has been seen a couple of times, outside Sleeping Beauty's castle just on the other side of the drawbridge. Or sometimes he's seen at night just outside his old apartment on Main Street, where occasionally you might smell a whiff of cigarette smoke, despite the fact that such things are banned inside the park. Walt and his family once lived there, so they could spy on visitors and listen to their opinion on the park. They would eavesdrop on their conversations from the second-floor apartment, just above the street level. George, a dead electrician, supposedly haunts the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, and every morning, cast members must call out, "Good morning, George," at the start of the day. Otherwise, the ride will mysteriously have issues all day long. Unexpected shutdowns and other strange things often occur if George isn't given his proper morning greeting. And have you heard about the animatronics in It's a Small World running all night long? Yep, those rumors are true too. In fact, quite a few of the lifelike robots stay in motion 24/7, even throughout the lockdown and park shutdowns a couple of years back. If you ask the management about it, they'll tell you it's because the attractions are cheaper to maintain that way. They break down less frequently if they're in constant motion. That's the excuse we get anyway. But I've come to realize there might be far more terrifying reasons for this. Something so disturbing and twisted that I wouldn't have thought it was possible if I hadn't witnessed it for myself. Teddy and I were on our lunch break when we found the storage room. We were looking for somewhere a little more private since Teddy had brought a bit of homemade greenery and his favorite piece of glassware that day. The park has miles and miles of tunnels crisscrossing beneath it, and Teddy and I had explored most of the labyrinth over our years of service. Like everything else in the park, there was a stupid nickname for these underground tunnels. They had been dubbed utilidors by some management types in the distant past. Most of the cast members just called them the tunnels, and they were so vast we often used golf carts to get from one end of them to the other. There were odd dead ends at some of the tunnels that seemed to intentionally lead to nowhere. We were currently in one such useless utilidor when we noticed an odd-looking door which appeared to be at least half a century old, if not more. It had a rusted placard hanging over its surface which read, "Obsolete animatronic storage." "Hey, didn't there used to be a vending machine there?" Teddy asked. "Who cares? Let's see if it opens. We've only got 20 minutes left," I said, looking at the time on my cell phone. The doorknob turned in my hand, and the two of us went inside. I looked for a light switch on the wall to my right, but I didn't find one. It was pitch black and impossible to see anything. Using the flashlight on my phone, I cast a beam of light around the room, trying to see what kind of space we were in. There were people-shaped forms all around us, draped in tarps and tablecloths. The room was as long as a football field, but it was narrow, only about 15 feet across. "Creepy," Teddy said, taking the words right out of my mouth. Well, I guess it did say this was animatronic storage. This must be really old. He wandered away from the door, and it clicked shut behind him. Something about that made me nervous, but I had ignored the feeling. The door had been unlocked, and that meant we'd be able to get out again. Still, I reached for the knob to check it. My hand was about to touch the polished brass when Teddy called out, making me jump. "Whoa! Check this out!" he said, sounding excited. I left the door, turning around to see what he was looking at. He had his cell phone light on as well, and was lifting up one of the tarps to look at what was underneath. "Man, this thing's freaky looking." He pulled the tarp away, and I saw what he meant. The thing hidden beneath was very creepy. It had the goateed face of a young man, but the ears and nubby horns of a goat, looking far too real. Its lower half looked like it also belonged to a goat. The thing reminded me of a satyr, those drunken, lustful half-goat gods from Greek mythology. I tried to figure out why it was making me feel so uneasy, and realized it was the eyes. They were too lifelike, far more real than the animatronics out in the park. And the look of the skin, the way it reflected the light and anything about it, it looked like it was a real creature. More likely, a man had been sewn to the body of a goat in a very thorough way, making the seams blend together perfectly. Teddy was already moving on to the next one, looking under another tarp. He left me alone with this one, and I looked back down at it as I let go of the cover and let it fall across its face again. Flinching backwards, I nearly screamed, as I could have sworn the eyes of the thing were looking at me, just as I dropped the tarp over its face. My heart was beating fast, and I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, or that the eyes had been looking up that way the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed. "We need to go," I heard myself say, but Teddy wasn't listening. "Holy crap, this one's even more jacked up. Dude, you gotta check this out." I opened my mouth to say, "No, let's get out of here," but my words caught in my throat. The satyr creature under the tarp was clearly moving now. Its head was still draped in the plastic sheet, but I could see it turning to look at me, as if its gaze could penetrate through the tarp. "Dude, come check this out," Teddy was yelling, pulling the next sheet off and dropping it to the floor. I saw what he was referring to, my eyes drawn to it despite the terror of the draped creature just in front of me. This one was tall, standing nearly 10 feet. It had one large eye instead of two. Man, whoever made these things was tripping on acid or something. Look at this thing. It looks like they jacked an eye from an elephant and stuffed it in some dude's forehead. I think they were trying to make a cyclops. I could barely hear him, as now the thing in front of me wasn't the only figure in the room which was moving. To my left, the entire row of covered forms were beginning to stretch and turn as they woke up from whatever sleep they had been in. Some were tall, some were short, like the satyr thing on my right, but all of them were alive. I realized it was very cold all of a sudden, and realized I could see my breath steaming out in the air. A compressor groaned to life, and I saw a nearby vent cough out a frosty plume as if Something had been jammed or broken and was suddenly operating again. The temperature in the room began to plummet, and a second later, I was freezing cold, the rushing air chilling the back of my neck. Finally, I was shocked out of my stupor and managed to get a word out. "Teddy!" I croaked, but too late. The giant Cyclops hand shot out and grabbed my friend by the throat. It lifted him up into the air while his legs kicked and his arms thrashed, trying to break its grip. He was choking and sputtering, flailing madly as he tried to free himself. The Cyclops firmly held him by the throat, and I heard the sound of cartilage and bones being crushed. His spine popped, and his head bent back at an impossible angle, his skull lolling backwards like a broken Pez dispenser. And then the giant dropped him to the concrete floor of the room, and his phone clattered and turned over, casting half the room in darkness again. I backed away, feeling like I was moving in slow motion, but unable to go any quicker. Reaching back for the doorknob, it felt like the tunnel had grown by 100 feet. It was further away than it could possibly have ever been. I kept backing up, taking slow, quiet steps. The figures were moving towards me, all of them closing the gap and slowly walking in my direction. Their forms were covered, draped in bed sheets and tarps and tablecloths, as if this place had been thrown together in a hurry, hastily constructed to house these possessed animatronics or whatever these creatures were. Cold air was filling the room, making it even more difficult to move. My skin felt like it was being stabbed with pins and needles, the freezing wind going right through my summer clothes. There was a sound of tearing flesh and blood being spilled. I looked to see several of the monsters were tearing the skin from Teddy's face, peeling it from his bones with some difficulty, like trying to open an underripe orange. The worst part was, it looked like he was still alive. He was opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water, his eyes wide open as if he'd be screaming if he were capable of it. I tried to tear my eyes away from it, but I couldn't. I found myself staring at him as they took the flesh off his face. I backed up hard into something and realized it was the door. In the darkness, I felt for the doorknob behind me, but I couldn't find it. The creatures were still moving towards me, all of their faces covered by sheets except for the massive Cyclops that had killed my friend. Its one huge eye was fixed on me, and as it moved in lockstep with the other creatures, they all seemed to share one hive mind. As they approached, a few stepped on each other's coverings, tearing them away and revealing their hideous faces. I saw a woman's upper body sewn onto the legs of a deer, and a man with the hindquarters of a bull, their faces full of mute anger. My hand groped for the doorknob desperately, and after several long moments, it settled on the smooth brass. It was so cold, almost frozen. I spun around, expecting the doorknob to turn easily, but this time it was stuck. I couldn't tell if it was locked or frozen solid, but either way it wouldn't budge. Feeling like there would be icy hands around my throat at any second, I was too terrified to turn around. I heard the sound of shuffling feet moving closer, the icy wind blowing through my clothes and raising goosebumps on my skin. I began pounding against the door with my fists, banging on it as hard as I could as I screamed for help, pleading for someone to save me. "Help! Help! Open the door!" I yelled at the top of my lungs. The corridor we had entered was a dead end, rarely used by anyone. Of course, this door would be locked from the inside, I thought to myself. Who would offer an escape to these animatronic demons? If they had ever been imbued with any form of failsafe, it was long ago out of commission and useless. These creatures had no mercy and no respect for human life. They wanted blood and flesh and meat to create more of themselves, to raise an army of undead robotic soldiers. Manic thoughts were racing through my head as I tried to think of another way out. There had to be something, some other way out. I turned around, hoping for some other exit to present itself, but instead I just saw hundreds of shrouded forms stepping closer and closer until they were just a few feet away. A gurgling, wheezing sound could be heard from behind them, and I realized it was the labored breathing of Teddy slowly dying. If I didn't get out of here, I'd be next. With one desperate move, I kicked out towards the head of the nearest shrouded figure. It was the satyr. My foot connected with his face, and as it did, the entire crowd fell back a step, as if hurting one of them would hurt all of them. I lashed out with another blow, punching it in the gut, and the crowd took another wounded step backward. I used the newfound space to my advantage and took a short running start towards the door. Kicking it hard with my boot, I connected squarely with the spot behind the doorknob. It rattled in the frame, but it didn't budge. Taking a quick look back over my shoulder, I saw the crowd of animatronic creatures were coming at me again with renewed anger. They looked furious at me for assaulting one of them, and apparently I had injured it. The satyr was slumped forward, its joints making creaky noises as it made its way towards me, its movements jerky and disorganized. I kicked the door again, harder this time, using every ounce of force I could muster. I heard something splinter and break, but it still wouldn't budge. Icy hands grabbed my throat from behind, and I threw an elbow backward to try to break free. It connected with whatever had grabbed me, and it didn't let go. Instead, its grip tightened, choking and squeezing my throat until I couldn't breathe. I let out another strangled cry for help, but no sound came out this time. The grip on my windpipe was making it impossible to call out. My feet were going numb from the cold, which seemed to have intensified even more somehow. I hadn't thought it was possible to feel any colder, but I realized that whoever was controlling the temperature of this place was doing this on purpose. These things didn't like the cold, and it put them in a state of hibernation. For some reason, this place had been almost room temperature when we entered, bringing these creatures back to life. With one more desperate effort, I lifted my leg and kicked as hard as I could, my heel connecting with the door just beside the latch. Something shattered and broke loudly, and the door swung open on its hinges. The momentum brought me forward, and I found myself tumbling back into the corridor. Whatever had grabbed hold of me came with me, the icy hand still around my neck. As I landed, the thing's fingers broke off like icicles, shattering on impact. The shrouded creature was writhing on the floor, looking as if it wanted to get up and chase me, but wasn't quite capable of it yet. It was still too cold. I stumbled to my feet and ran from there, not really thinking about my mistake until I was far past that point. When it occurred to me what I had done, it was too late. I had let those things out. I'd opened the door and freed them, and I had allowed the warm air inside so they could come back to life and escape. I was too terrified to stay in the park. I went home immediately without saying a word to anyone, then called my boss and told him I was sick with a stomach flu. I apologized, saying I'd been throwing up in the bathroom and didn't want to cause a code V while on stage. He told me that was okay, since he knew I was a dedicated employee, a trusted cast member who had been with the park for years. But he did ask if I'd seen Teddy, and I had to lie and tell him I hadn't. I'm supposed to go back to work tomorrow, for the first time since all of this happened. The worst part about it, nobody has reported Teddy missing. His family hadn't called to say anything either. It's almost like none of it ever happened. Except I've got the marks around my neck, the bruises that prove I didn't imagine it. I just got a strange message from Teddy on his cell phone. He says, "See you at work tomorrow, buddy," accompanied by a mouse emoji. Me and some of the cast members have a big surprise for you. For context, my mom has always been a little crazy. Never drowned me in the bathtub crazy, just a little off. Like sometimes, she was living in a different world than the rest of us. Like, when she looked at you, she knew in her heart that you were less real than her. I remember being really little and walking into her room to find her crying over a heap of her clothes on the ground. She had scissors in her hand, and she was cutting out every spot of purple she found. "I can't see it anymore, Cassie," she said through the sobs. "I can't see the colors I'm supposed to see anymore." I went and hid in my room after that. When my dad came home, he found me locked in my room and asked me what was wrong. I explained what had happened with Mom, and he just sighed and went to talk to her. What I couldn't explain was that I hadn't locked the door because I was afraid of her. I had locked it because it felt like an added barrier between myself and the reality that my mother wasn't okay. When they divorced, I don't remember any particular incident that broke the camel's back. It felt more like an inevitable conclusion that we had all accepted for years by the time it finally happened. What I do remember is listening to my dad read off a list of the big crazy moments from their marriage. Some of them were a surprise to me, like him coming home to find her hiding in a closet with a knife. Most of them, though, I remembered all too well. So when the judge looked at me and asked if what my father was saying was true, it was all I could do to nod back at her. Needless to say, my dad got custody of me. Even at 12, I knew that, regardless of his case, there had still been a chance of things not going his way. Afterwards, we went to Sullivan's and ate our weight in ice cream sundaes. I knew that it wasn't easy for him to raise me alone, but I also know that he was doing his best. My father was a 46-year-old middleware technician when he chose to become a single parent. He worked long hours for little pay, but still found time to tutor me in math and come to my track meets. He was patient. He was gentle. He was my hero. But all of that is just a lead-up to my story, right? It turned out that a few months ago, my mom got in contact with my dad. She said that she was getting treatment, that she wanted to make reparations. She gave him the number of her psychiatrist, who my dad promptly called. The man on the other end of the line assured my dad that his ex-wife wasn't the same person from 4 years prior. He said that she had changed and that she was getting better. He promised that getting closure with my dad and me was vital to her healing. At first, Dad refused. He was convinced that no amount of medication or therapy would change the woman who had haunted him and his daughter all those years. Eventually, though, he met her. He says it was just to get her off his back, to put the final nail in the coffin. Instead, he realized that she really was acting different, more lucid, more stable. They met a few more times, and with each meeting, he became more and more convinced that she had gotten better, that this time it would be different. When he walked into the house after seeing her, I couldn't tell what he was feeling. It felt like some kind of exhausted hope, the kind that shouldn't still have a pulse, kind of undead yearning. He needed help. I'd known that for years. He was working himself to the bone trying to take care of both of us. When I'd been born, my dad had signed up to be a part-time team member. Now it was just him and the growing shadows under his eyes. When he gently asked if I wanted to see Mom again, I nodded enthusiastically. Not for her or me, but for him. "It is so good to see you, sweetheart." Those were the first words she said to me when she sat down across from me at McDonald's. "I can't begin to apologize for everything I must have put you through." She looked better. I think after all those years, my memories of the way she acted and the way she made me feel had blended together into a flat nightmare. The woman squeezing my hand wasn't scary. It even felt appropriately motherly, though it made my skin itch. We met occasionally for months. We were alone once or twice when my dad had to step out for a work call. When we were, she would tell me about her group therapy, about all the friends she was making. She told me that it took her so long to realize that her biggest problem was self-isolating. "It drove me crazy, being alone," she said, "but it's okay now. Now I'm not alone." Eventually, my mom asked Dad if I could stay with her overnight. He was clearly uncomfortable with the idea and told her that he'd have to think it over. All I could think about was the work retreat, the trips with friends, all the times that my dad had missed out on living his life to take care of me. All for me. And I thought that maybe, just maybe, if I got to a place where my mom could take on even a little bit of the burden, that he might have his life back. So I told him that I wanted to go. I begged him to let me stay with her. Eventually, he agreed. "I'll be here to pick you up at 7, he said, as he pulled my suitcase out of the car. He'd picked me up from track and drove me straight to the cramped apartment building where my mom lived. "On the dot. If you need me before, promise me that you'll call, okay?" I promised him, offering a pinky when he gave me a stern look. He locked it with mine and took a deep breath. "Your mother's trying," he said. "I can appreciate that. I can even respect it. But I will drive my car through her front door if it means protecting you. Understand?" I laughed at the image of his scuffed Nissan hatchback smashing through the bricks and the drywall. I squeezed his hand. The evening was fine to start with. Her 2-bedroom apartment was neat and tidy, if a little small. It had a smell, too, like the ghost of something rotten hiding in the walls. But she let me put whatever I wanted on the TV. She even brought popcorn and soda for us to eat on the couch while we watched a police procedural. When I heard the oven timer ding, I asked her what she was making, and she stood up to go check on it. "It's your favorite, honey. Tuna mac." I felt the heat drain out of my face just a little. Tuna mac wasn't my favorite. I don't think I'd ever eaten it before that night. But I told myself to shrug it off. It had been years, hadn't it? It was all right for her to have a little misplaced memory. That alone didn't mean that anything was wrong. The phone buzzed with a text from my dad. "All good?" he asked. "You're such a worrywart," I responded, after giving his question a thumbs up. We ate at the table as the procedural show wrapped up. I felt like we should be talking, sharing, but there wasn't much to say, really. The absence of conversation stretched between us like a tightrope, but we didn't dare step onto it. As I scraped the last bit of tuna mac from my bowl into the trash, Mom told me that she had picked out a movie she thought we'd like. I agreed to it and sat on the couch as she put the disc in. It was a strange movie. Scary, but not in the way that a horror movie is scary. In the way that a nightmare is scary. Like everyone around you knows something that you don't. It followed a woman with amnesia trying to understand what had happened to her. At a certain point, I got a little too weirded out. The strange dream logic of the movie was like a headache I couldn't shake. I pulled out my phone and started to scroll through social media, trying to do so in a way that Mom wouldn't noticed. I shouldn't have worried. She was so enthralled by the movie that she was leaning expectantly forward, her eyes full of excitement and hunger. Just over halfway through, however, she suddenly grabbed my knee with an intensity that made me jump. I looked up at her to find that she was still looking just as intently at the TV. "Watch this. This part's my favorite," she said. I looked up at the screen to find the main character holding each other in bed, the sexual tension escalating rapidly. I felt my cheeks flush. I know how it feels to see a sex scene with your parents in the room, but this one was different. My dad always got a little uncomfortable in a way that made my discomfort feel more normal. He would usually fumble with the remote as he tried to skip through. With him, it was something to laugh about, a running joke between us. My mother's fingers digging into my skin as she commanded me to watch these two women going down on each other felt wrong, though. She shouldn't be touching me, shouldn't be encouraging me to watch. She shouldn't have that wild hunger in her eyes. I knew in my head that my mother had never been violent, had never tried to hurt me. But with her one hand on my knee, I couldn't help imagining the other one holding a knife behind her back. I felt like I was going to throw up, my throat quickly closing. I don't want to watch this," I finally blurted out. I don't think the words were even all the way out of my mouth before the TV flashed to darkness. The remote was already in her hand, like she'd been waiting for me to say something. "Okay, honey, I've got the spare room all made up for you, but before we call it a night, I need to feed my friend's cats. Can you come with me? I wouldn't feel right leaving you all alone." She held her hand out, beckoningly to me. The hunger was gone from her eyes, leaving just the model calmness she'd had for the last few months. "How long will it take?" I asked. I'm pretty tired." "Oh, just a few minutes. I promise, honey." She looked so sincere that not believing her words would have been like spitting in the face of God. I'd be a bad daughter, a terrible daughter, if I didn't trust her. Of course, I see it now. I see that a person trying to earn back their trust wouldn't act like they had never done anything wrong. A person trying to be better would make allowances for the pain their actions had caused. For her to look at me with the eyes of a mother that had never hurt or scared me should have been the first sign that she was living in a reality different from mine. But I didn't. I couldn't see that then. So I got in the car. My stomach started churning after 15 minutes on the road. I tapped my foot on the interior carpet, feeling the moments of the car trip slip on and on. "You said this wouldn't take long," I asked eventually. "Oh, silly," she responded. "I meant feeding the cats wouldn't take long. No, my friend lives a little bit out of town, but we're almost there. Don't worry." She turned the radio up after that, a pop station that kept fading in and out of static. I could feel my body trying to take a quicker, faster breath and tried to wrestle my panic away. I tried sending my dad a quick checking-in text as we turned off the highway, but the phone buzzed a moment later to tell me the text could not be sent. By the time we pulled into the snaking gravel driveway, we'd been driving for about 45 minutes, and the radio was a hornet's nest of static. To call the place a house was generous. It was a cabin nestled in some deep woods on the outskirts of town, the kind where you can just tell that the owner declined electricity and running water for the sake of independence. "Oh, sweetie, they're just gonna love you," Mom said as she turned the car off and dropped the keys into the cup holder. Then she got out and closed the door. "The cats?" I asked, the still warm interior of the car. The inside of the cabin was no better than the outside. When I walked in, my mom was already holding a long-neck lighter to a lantern, casting a dim and gloomy light around the place. The rug on the hardwood floor was moth-eaten and ragged. The rotten coffee table looked like it was ready to fall any second. The old couch was gray and muted, and I didn't want to find out if that was sun damage or dust. "So, your friend lives here?" I asked slowly. "I gotta go get some food from the shed," she called cheerily back at me, not answering the question as she stepped out the back screen door. I looked around me. No bowls or cat food, no scratching posts, not even any claw damage on the old couch. In that moment, standing in the dim light of the strange place, an unwelcome thought popped into my head. The storybook image of Hansel and Gretel being led into the woods by their father so that he could abandon them. She's not going to leave me here, I told myself. That would be crazy. The memory of her cutting the purple from her clothes was my only rebuttal. I listened closely to the silence of the night, sure that I would hear the sounds of feet on gravel, the sound of the engine turning over. Instead, through the overwhelming silence, I heard a shuffle, the creak of a board, the sound of someone trying to stay still, trying not to be perceived. Did she double back? Is she going to try to scare me? Why would she do that? I jumped when the screen door slammed open, admitting my mother and a 25-pound bag of dry cat food. "Hungry cats," I muttered. "Cats?" she asked. I saw such genuine confusion on her face that it made my eyes well up with tears. "The cats? That's what we're here to feed, right?" I said in a small voice. "Oh, hungry cats," she laughed. "Sorry, I misheard you. Yes, very hungry cats. Hungrier than you think." I helped her move the bag to the porch, where she flashed the screen of her phone around until she found a grimy dog food bowl tucked beneath the rotten benches. "There we are," she said. She haphazardly tore the bag open and spilled the kibble into the dusty bowl. "So, we can go now?" I asked. "No, sweetie," she said, turning to me with confusion. "We have to wait until the cats come to eat. Don't you know anything?" "Oh, okay," I said, my body beginning to shift and tighten in a way I'd consciously forgotten. The knowledge that the person in front of me was not living in the same reality as me shot through me like pain. The awareness that the wrong word would have my mother ripping my throat out with her teeth shook me. "So, what's your friend's name?" I asked. "What do you mean?" Her eyes were no longer on me. They were on the tree line, tracing the shadows between the trunks. "Your friend, the one who owns the house." "Yes, it's his house. He doesn't come by much anymore, but he told me I was free to visit whenever I wanted. I just had to feed the cats when I did." She turned to look at me, but I knew that she wasn't seeing her daughter. Her eyes drifted around me like she was evaluating a statue or a cut of meat. I looked away from her instinctively. I traced the same trees with my eyes, knowing that her unrelenting stare was on me all the while. Out of the corner of my eye, however, I caught movement. I concentrated on it. Without looking, I realized that I was seeing the shed where the food had been. The roof had caved in, like the victim of a violent crime. The door was hanging off its hinges. And there, poking out from behind the rotten mass of the shed, was a figure, a gray form against the shadowed backdrop of the woods. It loomed from the darkness like something was curious. "I know we might be here a while, waiting," my mom said, her eyes still on me. "Why don't you go lay down inside? I don't want you telling your father I kept you up all night." "Yeah," I said, my voice sounding 1,000 miles away. I felt like I was swimming through glass, slow and morbid. "Why don't I go lay down in the car? That way when we leave, you won't have to wake me up." "No," her voice was stern now, harsh. "You'll hurt your back in the car, Casey. Lie down on the couch." "But you're my daughter," she shouted, her voice rising in the night air. "When I tell you to go to sleep, you'll go to sleep, goddammit. Do you understand?" I felt my breath grow ragged, felt the tears falling, but I was no longer in my body. I was made of clay, soft and moldable, easy to smash and put away when you're done with it. My mom's arms were around me in an instant. "It's okay, honey. Mommy's here," she said, like she hadn't been the one to shout at me, even as she led me into the abandoned cabin. "Mommy's gonna make it better. You just need to lie down, all right?" She laid me on the dusty couch and patted my cheek with one hand. Then she walked through the door onto the porch and into the grass. "Here, kitty, 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 kitty," she began to coo. "Kitty, kitty, kitty, kitty." I needed to get up. I needed to run. I needed to get to the car, but my limbs felt heavy and weak. Like all it took was having my mother yell at me for my childhood fears to fall over me like chains. I tried to slow my breathing, to regain control of my body. I heard my mother's voice grow fainter and fainter. Was she walking away from the cabin? Was she walking into the woods? That's when I noticed the other sounds. Not the shuffling from before, not the sound of hiding. The sounds of walking, of careful, measured steps. I heard the boards creak in uneven rhythms, like something was slowly dancing, but it was all wrong. I heard the dry rasp of nails on peeling wallpaper. I heard laughter that sounded wet and dry at the same time. Something began moving against the back of the couch, and I stared with half-closed eyes as its shadow fell on the wall. In the outline cast by the dim little lantern, I saw something clamber onto the back of the couch. It perched like a gargoyle, but I could see that it was massive, the size of a man, balanced precariously on the wooden piece of furniture that groaned in protest. The thing above me emitted a low growl, like the rumble of a distant earthquake. I felt a heavy wetness hit my shoulder, and it began to run down my limp arm. I stayed still, not by choice, not because I thought it would keep me alive. In that moment, I knew that I was dead, that I would never see my dad again. I knew that I was going to be eaten or murdered or torn apart by whatever was drooling. And since I knew that to be true, I knew that there was no point in running, no point in fighting. It was over. All that was left was to accept that. "There you are, you nasty thing!" My mom's voice cut through the tension like a flashlight through darkness. "Your friends are all out here. Don't worry, you can play with her later after she's had her nap." Through the slits of my eyelids, I watched as the shadow of the figure leapt heavily to the ground. It danced violently into view, spinning in slow, uneven circles before it came to rest on all fours by my mother's feet. It looked mostly human, but the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, the knees bent at impossible angles. As it followed my mom through the door, it looked back at me. Where the eyes should have been were spheres of black glass. The surrounding skin was mottled and scarred in horrible twisting patterns. As it smiled, I saw that where the flat chiclet teeth should have been were instead sharp splinters of bone that seemed to bleed freely, long rivulets of bloody drool spilling onto the hardwood. It cocked its head at me, the black glass looking into my soul. Then it leaned its head back, inhaled long and deep, and followed my mother through the door. "Good kitty," I heard my mother say from the porch. Her voice was drowned out by the sound of dry food being shattered by sharp teeth. The back door, that was all I could think of. That rusted screen door was my only hope of escape. I slid myself off the couch as quietly as possible, my knee landing softly on the tattered rug. I stayed low to the ground and crept around the couch, stepping only on the boards that looked steady. "She'll be so excited to meet you, pretty girl," my mom said, still cooing to the thing on the porch. "And I know you'll be happy to see her, too. I promised you more wet food, didn't I?" Once I reached the screen door, I took a deep breath. The door had been loud when my mom had opened it earlier. Looking at the rusty springs holding the door closed, I could only hope that they had been the source. As I put my hands to the spring, a sound from the porch burrowed into my shaking bones. It was somewhere between a howl and a gasp, the sound of air running over broken windpipes. A song I didn't want to hear. It spoke to a deep, ancient part of my brain. It told me to hide. Shaking worse than ever now, I pulled at the spring just enough to pop it off the screw, holding it to the door. Then, my breath still, I pushed the door open and hoped for the best. It didn't make a sound, at least, not over the yowling on the porch. It swung open in silent invitation to the darkness. All that panic, all that fear wouldn't let me be careful anymore. I could see the nose of the car in the carport, could practically taste the dust covering the tires. I couldn't wait. My feet were quiet as I ran through the grass, but the second I stepped onto the gravel of the carport, the porch singing stopped. "Cassie," my mother called. "Honey, where are you?" In moments of true panic, I've never experienced time moving faster or slower, like people always describe. For me, things just start happening all at once. In my mind, there's no delineation between the moment I pulled the door open, the moment I scrambled for the keys, or the moment I snapped the car into reverse. They all happen simultaneously, like photographs, spinning in open air. As I changed gears to drive, however, I remember my mother standing in front of the car. The headlights played across the fabric of her dress. The dust kicked up by the car obscured her and the half-dozen creatures flanking her on either side, and in her eyes I saw real hurt, a genuine sense of betrayal. "What are you doing?" I saw her mouth. I didn't answer, in flagrant violation of the 3 months I had before I could drive a car without a guardian present. I tore down the driveway and away from this madness. I took every curve inadvisably fast, feeling the inertia of the car trying to buck me every time. I drove so fast that the cloud of dust behind me quickly obscured the house from view. Good riddance. I was almost to the main road when I caught sight of the thing out of the corner of my eye. It was one of the creatures, the one from inside the house, loping easily alongside my reckless driving. Its glass eyes weren't looking ahead of it, however. They were locked on me, and as it stared me down with its smile, I knew one thing beyond a shadow of a doubt. I had only imagined that these things were human, maybe deformed or mutated, but still human. Even driven insane with pain, a human could be reasoned with, empathized with, on some level. But these weren't humans. They had never been humans, not by a long shot. In that smile gleaming with blood, in the contortion of muscles where eyes should have been, I knew that these were something else, some other. That wasn't the shape of a human becoming an alien, but of something alien trying to become human. Only it had gotten the details wrong. I exploded onto the paved road and took off in what direction I thought the highway had been, keeping an eye out for the creature. I saw it pacing along the rooftops, tracking me through the flickering sodium vapor lights. By the time I hit the highway, the thing seemed to be gone, but I couldn't be sure. I think that was when I realized that the tears were shattering on my thighs, that I was gasping in air through sobs. So I drove, not towards home, not towards anywhere in particular. I pushed the speed limit, trying to put as much distance between me and the awful, awful cabin as I could. It wasn't until I felt something buzzing at my feet that I thought about stopping. In the chaos, my phone had fallen to the floor. I grabbed at it and saw that I had a dozen texts from my dad and 20 missed calls. My tears changed then, no longer those of an escapee. They were the tears of someone about to be rescued. I pulled into a rest stop and called him, sniffling. I tried to explain, but before I could, he cut me off and asked where I was. I read him the address of the stop. "Tell me everything," he said. I could hear him getting into his Nissan. So I did. I told him everything. I know that in stories like mine, the teenage daughter always holds back details so she isn't thrown in a mental hospital. But I didn't even think about that. I told my dad about the movie, about the tuna mac, about Mom saying that she just had to go feed some cats. When I told him about seeing the first creature behind the shed, I threw up in the passenger seat. When my dad eventually got to me, I fell into his arms and sobbed and screamed and shook. My father, the middle-aged IT professional with a bad hip, helped me like he had helped me when I was 5. "We're going to call the police," he said, running his hands through my hair. "We're going to tell them the important bits. She took you to a strange place and made you feel afraid, right?" "But how? I don't think we can explain the other parts, honey. But I don't think it makes much of a difference either way." I nodded. That made sense. We were halfway back home when the weight of the night settled over me, waves of tiredness washing me away to unconsciousness. I looked at the clock and smiled when I woke up. It was 7 a.m. "On the dot," I said, starting to drift away. "On the dot, kiddo," just like I said. That was a week ago. After we talked to the police, they sent a patrol car up to the cabin for my mom. When they got there, no one was around. All they found was an empty bag of dog food next to a bowl, with my mother's shoes neatly beside it. According to the county records, the cabin's been abandoned for decades. The last owner had died before the turn of the century, and the land deed was split between his children. The police talked to all of them, but none of them have any connections to my mom. They assured us that they're still looking into it, but I'm not holding my breath. Doesn't matter anyway, because we're leaving. The house is already listed. My dad's been doing online interviews for a new job in a new city. He stayed home from work all week, and he called me out of school. We keep the doors locked and the windows drawn. The revolver he normally keeps in a safe is always nearby. As soon as he can lock down a new job, he says we're booking our flights. We're getting the hell out of this town, from my mom and from those monsters. In the meantime, we're sleeping in the family room. I sleep on a pull-out while Dad sleeps in the love seat. He's watching over me. I can't wait to leave, though, because sometimes, as hard as he tries, my hero falls asleep, and sometimes when he does, and I listen really close to the silence, I can hear that awful, awful singing. And every night, it's getting a little bit closer. I've always been afraid of the water. Something about its mysterious depths obscuring the unknown has always left me feeling uneasy. In fact, for that reason, I've never learned how to swim. My father tried to teach me once. We were at our local lake, enjoying a beautiful Sunday afternoon, the sun shining brightly as it bathed us in its warmth. I innocently dipped my feet in the water, smiling at the jovial laughter that fluttered in the air. "I think it's high time you learned how to swim," my father told me. I giggled, happy at the revelation that my father was finally going to show me how to swim. I retreated my foot to the shoreline and followed him to the edge of the dock. He jumped in and remained submerged for several seconds, my eyes fixated on the rippling current where my dad waited to come back up. Time slowed to an excruciating pace as my patience grew with concern. Splash! "Okay, kiddo, your turn. Jump in and I'll catch you," my dad said, as he surprised me with a big splash. My smile returned as I saw him, and all the confidence was restored, knowing that nothing bad could happen as long as my dad was around. So I took a deep breath and gripped my nose, careful to aim so that I'd land in my dad's open arms. The most odd feeling inundated my senses as my feet lifted off the ground. Anxiety shot across my mind as my eyes remained on my father's gaze. I saw his smile slowly morph into something most hideous. "Ah!" my dad yelped out. By the time I landed in the water, my dad had disappeared from sight. I kicked and thrashed as I called out for him. I could feel my body getting heavier and heavier as I began to sink. I screamed and pleaded for help, not knowing what was happening to my father, and within seconds I had descended into the abyss of emptiness, the world above continuously fading away as darkness engulfed me. I don't know how long I was in the water for. I woke up with an audience overlooking my small body. A man hovered above asking if I was all right. I wanted to respond, but the only words that came out were, "Where's my dad?" Everyone's eyes slowly dipped down, as if they were doing their best to make eye contact, and that's when I saw him out of the corner of my eye. He was 20 feet away, laying unmoving and dormant. He was dead. Apparently, it had been a water snake. I didn't even know those things existed, but the creature bit him, and unfortunately, that's all it took for my father to drown. Ever since that day, I've been terrified of the water, doing my best to avoid it if all possible. Even when I shower, I feel my blood pressure spike. So, I moved out into the middle of nowhere, as far from any lake or coast as I could get, deep into the heartland, surrounded by the vastness of tree lines. I lived in a newly built apartment complex, surrounded by beautiful and vibrant forests. Each morning I would get up and serve myself a cup of coffee and walk over to my balcony as I stood mesmerized by the enchanting woods. It was truly a wonder. The only issue I had was this new construction next to my door. They had already cut down several trees, excavating the land. Apparently they were going to build some gas station, and for now, all I saw was one giant empty hole. I guess that's where they were going to put the gas lines for the pumps. I did my best to ignore the eyesore, only knowing that it was going to get worse. I've even thought of different ways on how I could get the construction to stop, but never really acted out any of these ideas, just knowing more that it was a fantasy than anything. I work from home, and each day I'd hear the drilling and the pounding coming from the site, and I would shut my eyes tightly, doing my best to drown out the sound. So when a heavy storm came to town, I was elated knowing that they would have to halt the construction. The rain was relentless. I hid in my closet like some child as the ponderous raindrops bombarded my window, the thunderous clash of lightning terrifying me. The next day, to my delight, the storm clouds had dissipated, and all that remained were puddles of water, as the sun blessed us with its glow. I smiled, knowing that the construction crew would wait for the site to dry, which could take days. So I walked over to my kitchen, as I had always done, and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, practically giggling with the pleasure of my newfound solitude. I couldn't hear a sound, just pure silence, well, other than the birds chirping. I walked over to my balcony to look out over the tree line, and inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of pine, and that was when I looked down at the once massive hole that was no longer empty. Rather, it was now a pond of mud. Ugh, I whispered. But that's when I saw it. Couldn't believe my eyes. There was something moving in the water. What the hell is that? I asked. A complete befuddlement. Whatever it was, the thing was enormous, practically taking up the entire pond. I couldn't make out the shape, and all I could do was stare in disbelief as the thing thrashed around. Maybe it's a flock of birds, I rationalized to myself. I could feel my skin begin to crawl as beads of sweat formed on my brow, my breathing becoming heavy as I knew I had to step away from the balcony. I ran back to my closet and curled up in the fetal position as I counted backwards from 10, trying to calm myself. After about 30 seconds, I cautiously left the solace of my closet and went back to my desk to work. I tried my best to forget the anomaly that lay in the depths of that pond, but that thrashing sound, sounds of water splashing around ceaselessly, was what filled my day. I did my best to drown out the sounds. My anxiety was at an all-time high, and I did the only thing I could think of. I took a heavy dose of sleeping medication and slept in my closet. The next morning, I woke up feeling a little silly, knowing that I'd overreacted. The mysterious encounter surely had a reasonable explanation, and of course, I'm no zoologist, so with that reassurance, I took a step towards my balcony, feeling the most brave I ever had. As always, I inhaled deeply and closed my eyes for several seconds, preparing myself to look down at that muddy pond. As my eyes cautiously opened, I saw nothing. The pond was gone, just an empty hole as it had been before. I almost felt like jumping in celebration, but suppressed the urge. Rather, I went to pour myself a fresh cup of coffee, all smiles. As the bitterness engulfed my taste buds, I heard the most dreadful sound I could imagine, and I ran back to the balcony as I heard it again, the sound of thunder. "No!" I exclaimed, not understanding where the hell the storm clouds had come from. To my nightmare, the forecast was grim. Somehow we were going to be consumed by a terrible thunderstorm for the next few days. As the night went on, I tried my best to ignore the storm that had encapsulated my apartment building. I stayed away as far as I could from the windows, and especially from the balcony. Though I wasn't going to hide in the closet like some coward anymore, I could just think of my father any time I felt that tingling sensation of fear try to creep its way into my mind. I honestly did pretty well. I spent most of the night watching movies, completely immersed in the reality of entertainment, and soon I fell asleep. That night, I dreamt of my father, me and him back at that dreadful lake, him calling out to me to jump into his arms, but this time I could clearly see the beast behind him. Well, I could see the thrashing of the current as something ghastly revealed itself. It was as if it was a tentacle, and I couldn't stop looking. "Jump, son! Jump, son. Jump, 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 jump. And with that I woke. But to my horror, I could still hear my father calling out to me. Jump, jump, jump. The voice was coming from outside, and I could feel all the blood leave my body as I froze in utter terror. The rain continued to pour down, but even with all the thunder, I could still hear the voice. Dad? I whispered. I had to be going crazy. Perhaps this was some fever-induced nightmare, and I cowered underneath my covers like some frightened child, hiding from the monster that was in my closet. I even covered my ears, but some of that voice, it still came through, like it was broadcasted into my mind. Finally, a bit of courage erupted inside of me. Maybe it was just frustration, but I decided to confront the voice, so I walked towards the balcony. I slid open the glass door and stepped out into the waterfall of rain and stared down into that chasm of water. Before I could even look, I heard the thrashing of that horror there, as if the creature had come right out of my dreams. I couldn't see the entire beast, but I could see the tentacles. What do you want? I shouted. Jump, 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 jump. That's all I heard as I looked around in utter disbelief. No one else was here. No one else was seeing this. I thrust myself back into the apartment, sheltering away from that demon as I collapsed to the floor. My heart had virtually escaped my chest as I did everything in my power to calm down. I looked towards the closet and was tempted to hide like I always did, but I was too weak to move, so I crawled. As I squirmed across the hardwood floor, the voice only became more thunderous, breaking through the deluge of the storm, and before I could make it to the closet, I had passed out. I woke up the next morning, my clothes completely drenched, but not in rainwater. Rather, it was my own sweat, and my head was throbbing like I was hungover. I got up from the floor and looked around with absolute bewilderment. That's when I remembered the creature. I couldn't hear the voice anymore, and I sighed in relief. I also noticed it had stopped raining, though the dark clouds still hovered above with malice, leaving me in utter angst. I contemplated the idea of just leaving, but I knew I had to conquer my fear. There was no monster in the water. That would be impossible. Even so, I was filled with trepidation. But I stuck my chin in the air and decided that I had to stay. No hiding in the closet, no breathing heavy. Instead, I was going to confront this nightmare. As night approached, extinguishing any of the sun that might have been apparent, I poured myself a glass of wine while I sat in the dark and waited for the voices to come. It was raining again, the thunder back, and I took a sip each time the thunder burst around me. I waited and drank, sitting there hoping to hear it. I would occasionally get up and walk over to the balcony, thinking I would see those horrid tentacles. But there was nothing. Eventually, I fell asleep in my favorite chair, alcohol simmering on my breath as an empty wine bottle lay tilted over next to me. That's when I heard it. A monstrous roar engulfed my apartment, practically shaking the walls. I jumped out of my chair, mesmerized by the sound. I looked around, confused, and then ran towards the balcony. And there it was, the tentacles thrashing again. I needed to know what this thing was. Why did it sound like my dad? I charged down the stairs, sprinting towards the beast. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got there. I just knew I needed to see what this thing wanted with me. I stood next to the small pond, those tentacles still sputtering around. The thing was massive up close, and I looked into the water, trying to see what it was, and that's when I saw the eye. It was beneath the slithering tentacles, and it was staring right at me. I froze with disbelief. I couldn't look away, almost as if this creature had possessed my body. Jump, 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 jump. My father's voice called out to me again. Maybe he was down there too. Maybe somehow he'd survived, and I needed to know. So I jumped in. I couldn't see anything, just darkness and Disquietude surrounded me. I couldn't even see the tentacles anymore. I just began to sink. I carelessly drifted further down into the abyss, not able to hear my father anymore, and I could slowly feel my mind beginning to drift into obscurity. I think I was dying, and that's when an arm from above grabbed me and pulled me back up. I was barely lucid. I couldn't see who saved me as I lay on the muddy shoreline of the pond, practically unconscious. That's when I heard the mysterious person tell me, "I'll catch you." And then I passed out. I awoke to the sound of construction machinery firing all around me, while the sun shone down on my face. I looked around and saw that the pond was gone, dried up, only leaving an empty hole, just as it had before. As I stood to my feet, trying to have resolve over my senses, I smiled and understand who had saved me. I don't know what the monster was, or whether it was real or not, or whether any of that actually happened, but I'm no longer scared of the water. Even if that beast did try to come back, I know now that my father will always be there to save me. Charlie Valentine pulled 3 nights' worth from his veins, then plugged the needle into the throbbing muscle of the register. The scalped motel owner watched the colors swirl from black to a very faint navy blue. He hesitated, a scowl tugging the grafted replacements that took up where his hair had been. Charlie tried to entertain himself by imagining the color and style his half-formed melon may have had. It took away a little of the tension that he felt from the man's critical gazing of his blood that, if not for the quantity, would have been worthless. Obviously, the owner's thoughts flowed through the same stream as he lowered his hands to the keyboard and began to 2-finger type. "I'll give you 2 nights, the owner said in frustration. Perhaps it was out of the goodness of his heart, business being slow, or just being too lazy to perform a refund. But whatever it was, Charlie was relieved. He hoped for at least 1 night to get the edge off. 2 may be enough to come up with a plan. The Latchers were off his scent for now, and with Charlie pumping so much pollution into his veins, his taste would be difficult to recognize. But they wanted him, and badly. The owner finished his monotonous plinking away at the keyboard, and the vase-shaped muscle twitched, then swallowed Charlie's payment, finishing with a final spasm that seemed more of a gag. Beggars can't be choosers, he thought to himself. He held the statement in his subconscious like a billboard as he took the bone-chiseled key from the owner. 19, the man murmured, then returned to the television embedded within the flesh of his wall, forgetting Charlie altogether. Likewise, Charlie turned and hobbled out into the parking lot as he lit up a cigarette, trying to kill the stink of the place. The muscle and bone that made up the foundation was barely preserved. The teeth lining each window sill and doorway had blackened. The skin roof had shriveled so much from the desert heat that a greenish rotting cancer had begun to fester from the breaks which had cracked open. Apart from a faint, rot-carrying breeze into Charlie's ears, it was quiet. No cars rumbled down the highway. Nothing for anyone to see, except for the ones already seeing it. Nothing worth 12 ounces of blood, which Charlie finally began to feel the effects of. He shuffled over to the rusty Pinto, poked the trunk, and grabbed his deflated balloon of a travel bag, then pierced the football-shaped cyst that held the still fresh kidney. He shut the trunk before the smell could escape and cause him to vomit. That was something he could not handle right now. He was feeling very dizzy, and he needed to lie down desperately. Needed to sleep, though he wondered if he could, and what good it would do. If he slept tonight, he would just bring on tomorrow even quicker. He thought of the gun as he hobbled painfully past each door. It may be a consideration sooner than he intended. The stump where his foot had been severed was bleeding. He was in no shape to run anymore, Perhaps this would be a fitting place for him to end his pursuit. After all, he'd had a good chase, hadn't he? Bloodying the noses of the processors enough for their retribution. 2 latchers died by his switchblade, their screams still echoing deliciously in his memory. Though one of the screams was in his own voice, and Ruby Brennan's eyes of dazzling silver gazed up at him as he rained down blow after blow. The attention was away from her, at least. That was all that had mattered. She'd be safe, as long as the latchers kept after Charlie. So the gun option was out, until he knew for sure that he was to be processed, as he had nothing more that the latchers would want to take for themselves. Sleep needed to be his plan. He sighed warily as he reached for the door. The ivory felt hollow in his hands, cheap. No doubt someone behind on their debt, like Ruby's parents. Members of a mindless and mangled workforce, hoping to spare their beautiful baby girl their hardships. Until, of course, they had nothing left to give. At least, nothing that they could spare, and continue to keep on grinding for work. So the key could very well have come from the unfortunate loved one of a debtor. Charlie unlocked the door and stumbled inside, the block replacing his foot, thumping into the doorway, kicking some black teeth across the floor. He flipped on the light long enough to see that the room was what he expected. Basic bed with a mattress of fat, hair-stuffed pillows, TV mounted atop a cartilage and sinew forged table, toilet and sink made of cheaply polished bone. He locked the door and flipped off the lights, dropping his bag and collapsing face first onto the bed. It sloshed back and forth for a few moments with the impact, then became still. From the wall, he heard an argument to his left and love-making to his right. He rolled over on his back and whistled a melancholy tune, one he'd written a long time ago, it seemed. The lyrics were sung from his memories, back before his voice had been stolen. He reached up and touched his throat where the veins of the latcher had burrowed and pulled out his vocal cords, then spewed out the rubbery muck that seared shut their replacements. He didn't think anything could hurt so bad. That is, until he saw the latchers later that day, one singing with his voice, the other one looking at him with Ruby's eyes. They lied as they died. That was enough comfort for him as far as the end of the ordeal went. But to imagine tears flowing from black, lifeless spheres of Ruby's eye sockets were something that Charlie could not man up and face. He fled the scene as a hoodlum and a murderer. Such was life. A fly landed beneath his right eye, crawling down his lips. Charlie didn't bother swatting it away. He felt a couple more hover over his stump, landing and surveying at their potential meal. A place to eat and breathe safely, away from the harshness of the desert. They were no different than him. Charlie felt as though there would be bad karma for him if he were to deny these tiny scavengers safety and comfort when he himself longed for it as well. Just as he thought of this, however, the explosion of the Pinto lit up the room and shattered the glass. Charlie jolted upright, tiny shards falling from him and tinkling on the floor. They were here. How long had he been lying down? Did they just miss him entering the room? Was it really them, or did somebody even more desperate than he try to steal the vehicle? If so, there was an example of karma, which he feared a few seconds ago. He grabbed the bag from the floor without a thought of specks of glass cutting his hands. He unzipped it and reached inside for the gun, feeling the skin that had once been his heel, now manufactured into a grip. In the light, Charlie could see the intricate workings that the bone of his foot had made. A sloppily made barrel that was an amalgamation of his toes melded and tacked together in a straight line. Along the side were mishmashes of nail and muscle, forming the shape of a mock firearm, with skin covering the grip and hammer. Charlie chambered the first 5 rounds with little confidence. Marlowe promised an untraceable and dependable weapon, for its allotted rounds at least, but Charlie couldn't shake the doubt he felt. All things would be revealed shortly. The closed blinds, which were surprisingly intact, were subtly carried upward by the breeze outside. Through its movement, Charlie could catch glimpses of his flaming car. He approached the window and saw 2 jet-black sedans pulled up on each side, their glass blown out and blood visible on their hoods. There was a sound of scrambling and panting, along with the fresh dust being stirred up from the earth. Charlie looked downward, and he could see that one of them was writhing about in agony. It had opened up to reveal its collection of eyes, tongues, hair, organs, and blood. So much blood. 3, Charlie whispered to himself, with a harsh gravel that filled him with even more hatred upon hearing it. He reached over and slowly unlocked the door. Within the 2 adjoining rooms, the argument and the lovemaking had ceased, replaced by worried mumbles and whimpering. If they were also seeing what was outside, they had no doubt been more frightened by the 2 black cars and the dying latchers than the explosion. However, their quiet murmurs turned to screams as Charlie heard their doors bursting open. He missed their approach to the nearby room, and his. The door broke off its hinges and a latcher stepped inside. It was in the form of a man, long black hair, wide green eyes, dirt and blood speckling across the agitated face. It stepped past Charlie for a moment, not seeing him to its right, but noticed him quickly as he attempted to aim at its head. The latcher shrilled and caught his arm, which held the weapon. Already the burrowing began in his wrist. Charlie grabbed its throat and struck it in the mockery of a face with his forehead as hard as he could. The latcher turned loose, but its veins were still holding inside his wrist. He grabbed the tendrils and began pulling them out from his flesh when the latcher slammed its open palm beneath Charlie's chin and began to strangle him. The day he begged for his voice to be taken instead of Ruby's eyes, he knew if he could just endure the agony, no matter how long it lasted, she'd be all right. She wasn't, though. Now the pain was beginning again as this latcher began to pierce its way into his flesh. Charlie defiantly ripped free from his wrist, placing the gun in the creature's chest and pulling the trigger. His ears went immediately deaf, and the explosion that had come from what had once been his foot nearly blinded him as well. The veins left his throat, and a large hole sloshed its red muck on the floor. As with the latcher outside, stolen bits of endless victims began pouring out and wiggling around in the open air. Despite the muted sound, Charlie still made out its scream amongst the visceral carnage. 4, he shouted as he cocked another round into the chamber. Charlie no longer felt the doubt in his weapon. Instead, he readied it towards the doorway, and as if in answer to his instincts, another latcher stepped inside. Not having time for the stolen eyes to adjust to the darkness, it never saw the one it was searching for, only a sudden flash that seemed more akin to a bolt of lightning. The explosion of its head sent Charlie into a maniacal joy. He only wished that Ruby could see this chaos that he had created, smell the sweet stink of their filth tainting the air with their abominations. It was enough to install a small mouthful of vomit, but Charlie didn't allow the revulsion to hinder his enjoyment. He simply let the word 5 follow the bile from his lips. There was at least one more. Likely it was in the room to his left, seeing how the others came through the door at more of a right angle. But Charlie couldn't be certain. He thought for a moment that he might wait for another to walk through the door, but its still writhing comrade had fallen outside into the light of day. No doubt it knew by now where he was, and that he was armed. Charlie waited for his hearing to hopefully come back. His wrist began to hurt badly from the oozing wound and the surprising intensity from the gun recoil. As much as he felt victorious so far, the pain was a reminder of just how limited his time was. Again, he questioned himself what the whole point was to this resistance. They may leave Ruby and her family alone for now, but who's to say they wouldn't tie everything back to them? They would require whatever their demented justice demanded, and she would be the one to pay the price. It wasn't only her eyes that held value. All that had initially captured his heart now only added more sorrow. Every element of Ruby would be taken. She would be mangled, a husk, like her own parents, in just a matter of months, unless she found a better means of success in life, besides being the prettiest EMT in Ellisboro. Only those who have plenty to give can keep what they have, yet beneath even the most successful life, the Latchers wait for their failure so that they can take the pieces they desire. There was nothing for it. He stepped over the carcass he had made and into the sun, which was now pleasantly warm compared to the room. The flames of the earlier explosion were beginning to die. His hearing returned fully, and he could now hear the whimpering of his neighbors, the lovers, as the rumbling growl of the last Latcher seeped out their broken door. Charlie approached painfully as his stump began to itch. There was the shape of a woman in the corner of the room, and the closer he got, the more Charlie could see that the Latcher had a hold of her. He limped inside, keeping his eyes on what was soon to be number 6. Suddenly, though, just like the one that broke into his room, he was surprised from the right and thrown to the ground. He made a stupid mistake, and now everything had come to a sudden end. The Latcher that surprised him placed his foot atop his spine and pressed down viciously. It was over. The couple was allowed to leave now that they had what they wanted. They spoke to him about the processors and how he was destined for pain before death, but he tuned them out. It didn't matter what they said. It all summed up with an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He deserved what had happened to him, but as long as Ruby, 2 shots erupted. Charlie initially believed that they had decided to kill him with his own weapon, discovering otherwise when the shrieks and the smell filled the room. A hand gently turned him over, and Charlie Valentine felt the pure crystal drops that fell from Ruby's black eyes. "10, 20, 30, 40. It wasn't fast enough. Ruby Brennan let her instincts as a paramedic take the wheel of the Latcher's sedan. It was the least damage from the explosion of Charlie's car, yet all the glass had been blown out, and she could feel delicate cuts from the tiny remains. She had to ignore it, had to keep herself focused. She had her patient. Now she just had to get to safety. 50, 60, 70. Still not fast enough. Never fast enough. The wheel of skin began to quake in Ruby's grip. Somehow, through her panic, she caught herself rubbing the small peach hairs of the wheel. Charlie lay unconscious in the passenger seat, his body reeking of blood and rot. She had to quit thinking about him. She couldn't stop now to tend to him. Its shape was growing larger in the rearview mirror. 80, 90. The torrent of rain, rushing in through the shattered windshield, brought the wafting heat of summer, despite the dark billows that brought a premature night. The rain would wake Charlie up. He'd be in pain, and she couldn't help him much without any real sort of medical equipment. 100, 110, 120, 125, 123. A bolt of lightning, the silhouette of the thing in the distance. Not fast enough. Never fast enough. The engine seemed to hold back on its efforts, seeing how its former masters had been dealt with. She focused her eyes to the empty desert road, then to the dash. The tank was going on a quarter of blood. Between the two of them, they may have been able to get it up to half, if it weren't for Charlie's stupidity and the thing running them down. It has multiple heads. She didn't dare look. 122, 124, 123. Please, please, please. Kick him out. The smoker with Caesar's face was lounged in the back seat. Zoot suit, fat cigar of shadow, his exhalations releasing clouds of secondhand panic. Ellisboro is 20 miles from here. I told you before, shut up, Ruby shouted, turning her head slightly to see a mockery of Caesar's playful smirk began to form as it took in another draw. You 'member your mother's eyes, Ruby. 'Member how she'd kiss the scuffs and marks you'd get from playing out in the street. Yeah, you do. She can't do that no more, can she? Ruby felt the tears seep from where her mother's eyes had set before. She now had Mama's eyes again. Step 1. The smoke was thick now, choking her with its fumigation, despite all the glass being shattered and the violent air passing through the car. The smoker's words were perfectly audible, despite the roar of the engine and the deafening wind in her ears. Look in the mirror, sweet thing. So much more to lose. But watch that right turn ahead. Ruby was aware of it, the car screeching, burnt rubber faintly mingling in with the stink of Charlie's dead weight. His seatbelt wasn't on, yet somehow he remained fairly stationary during the turn, only his head lolling about, like a corpse. That's right, sweetheart, he's dead, and even if he isn't, he will be soon. Say by some miracle you make it. Will anyone help you with the render after you? Another bolt of lightning illuminated the darkness, as if in dramatic response to the lines of the smoker's performance. Ruby fought the urge to look and see the thing's progress. Instead, she tried to glance at the dash once more. The low traction light was on. She shuddered at the hopelessness of her childish nightmares, all coming true. Yeah, baby, that's what it is, a render. In fact, the first time you heard that they were coming for your daddy's tongue, you believed it was one of them who'd do the job. You cried for hours. You made your mama hysterical. Your parents' lives were caving in on them, and all you could think about were those terrifying stories your friends told you. Friends like him. Ruby could picture a grotesque finger pointing at Charlie. He was right. Charlie told her all those frightening stories of the ones that tore those who fled the law to shreds. Frankie and Caesar would beg to hear them. She would too, she guessed. She remembered Kat being too afraid and leaving whenever he would start telling them. They'd laugh at her. Ruby now wished that she had followed her. Ruby! The stink of his breath was in her ear, a cloud filling her vision as the words released. Fresh tears from the sting of the smoke, or the truth they spoke. They're real. There is one behind you now, girl. Getting closer. When it sees your face, they'll all know who you are, and they'll always come after you. The figure sat back and relinquished his cigar. That smirk, now a dark yellow grin. And it's all his fault. A shower began to fall. Cold. Would have been refreshing on any other day, save for the consistent lightning. Just as Ruby predicted, Charlie began to stir. He raised his head and winced in pain, then held up his hand to block the rain pouring in. Ruby felt hatred for him. Such a stupid man, going out of his way to throw even more guilt on her. Despite the warped fratricide her mind had conjured up, Caesar was the one she had loved, and Charlie knew it. Yet, he'd constantly written songs about her, poetry, spoken in smoky bars, even got some blood for his trouble, had a chance for even more, but he turned it down. He didn't want to leave Ellisboro. It's home, he said. She knew the reason, just like she knew the meaning of his songs. Silver linings, when you sway, waltzing Rebecca, checking my rear view mirror. She stopped herself, kept her eyes forward, more turned ahead. The tires screeched along with something else, something close. She looked at Charlie, seeing his haggard, idiotic visage staring at her through the mists and flashes of the storm. Confused, stupid, he was about to say her name when a sudden impact smashed the back of the car. It wasn't enough to make them swerve, but it was enough to make Ruby realize just how out of time she was. If she was going to give him up, it was now or never. "My gun," Charlie mumbled. She practically saw his look of terror in the corner of her eye. "Where's the gun?" Ruby didn't answer. More turns, more screeches. She had it in her coat pocket. No doubt it was the actual source of the stench that she had been suffering through. It had 5 shots. That meant only one remained. She had hoped for more, but was relieved to know that there was at least one left. She remembered seeing the explosion as she neared the motel on her motorcycle. Then, after she stopped, she heard 2 shots ring out. It was a war zone. The Latchers screamed, and she thought she heard Charlie's mangled voice shouting something. She'd finally found him, but was it really worth getting involved now? "You should have kept on, Ruby," the smoker began again, a raspy machine gun laugh filling her mind. "Should have turned on the top 20 and headed west. But you didn't, did you? Nah, you had to check on Chuck, had to make sure he was okay. He wasn't. He was gonna reap what he sowed, but you had to help him, didn't you? How do you think I feel that it was just 3 short weeks before you'd leave town, like I'd been begging you to? And you did it for Charlie Valentine, not me. Now you 2 lovebirds are gonna get ripped apart together. Your screams are gonna get drowned out in the rain. You might make a couple of nice ashtrays, or faucets, or rooftops, or maybe a rear view mirror." Ruby suddenly saw her 2 ink-black spheres encased within her soaked brows, but past her reflection, clinging to the back of the vehicle, the render was stooping its 3 heads through the window frame. The smoker was now sitting comfortably with his legs crossed. The stub of his cigar brightened from its final draw. "Make it right, baby," he said, flicking the butt away without taking his eyes off of Ruby. "Charlie?" He didn't look at her. Instead, he began to rise from the seat and make his way to the back. "Charlie!" His head shuddered in agony. Ruby saw his hand fall upon broken glass left behind in the console. She remembered a knock at her door 3 weeks ago. Charlie's sad face as he said without greeting, "There's broken glass. Put your shoes on and come in." He was always looking out for her, always worried, always caring. The alley was where Caesar hid the ring he had made from some molars. Charlie was the only one who told her where he hid it. Charlie was the only one of Caesar's friends that he trusted, unwavering in all things. Another would greet her at the door a few days later, with Charlie's beautiful voice, but not his face. "Charlie!" Ruby screamed as she forced him back down. "Seatbelt!" The heads were breathing in her ear like the smoker, only these were real, and she could do something about them. She grabbed hold of the emergency brake, pulled, and felt the writhing limbs crush past her face as the render was ejected from the front of the car. The screech of tires once more mingled with the sound of the abomination, and to Ruby's great satisfaction, its cries surpassed their frequency. The car overtook the render, and the grating of its body between the concrete and the weight and the speed of the vehicle made Ruby grit her teeth in defiance. However, the creature began to resist, and through the combination of its spasms and inertia, the car suddenly turned clockwise and began to flip. Ruby's existence became a storm of metal, skin, hair, and loose glass. The rotations seemed to increase in speed the more she wished for an end. Her thoughts were a void of uncohesive ponderings throughout the chase. Mother's eyes, Daddy's lectures, victims she'd have given up on and allowed for the processors to take, Charlie's songs, Caesar holding her while the sun set, giving another spiel about his plans. "We're gonna get out of here, baby. We're gonna head north in spring, and by then I'll have enough plas to get us to a nice place, away from the grind plants. You can be the sexiest surgeon in whatever town we choose. Hell, I'll polish bone for new Chrysler models when I'm not mooching off your looks and the plas you bring in. Just gotta hang in there, baby. Keep those eyes on the future. I ain't gonna end up like my folks, and I know you don't want that either." Ruby felt Caesar's hands fall away, and a cold, wet grip on her wrist as she was being pulled painfully out of the vehicle. Her eyes were blinded by a flame in the darkness that raged from the engine. "Ruby! Ruby, wake up!" Charlie's voice seemed far away, though she knew he was right there, pulling her from the wreckage. Always worried, always caring, always... She looked back to the car and saw that he was upside down, struggling to free himself from the seatbelt as the flames rose. Ruby looked up to see 3 eyes from 2 different heads looking down at her. She screamed and began to thrash herself, but the render held her with pure malice in its grip. Many of its jumble of arms and legs were either partially or fully broken. One of its 3 heads swung about lifelessly, and as the creature pulled Ruby along, it left a large, thick trail of blood and bile. If Ruby was seriously injured, she didn't know about it yet. At that moment, right now, she was only aware of the realization and the hopelessness of her situation. Charlie was going to burn to death, and she was being pulled into one of her childhood nightmares. As she fought, she felt the weight of the gun swing beneath her from the pocket of her open coat. If she could just get it. Charlie began to scream. Ruby's heart sank. She tried to look in his direction, but the abomination suddenly tossed her down to the dirt. Ruby had landed on the gun, which thankfully hadn't discharged, but as she reached around to grab it, one of the limbs had her throat. The dead parts had begun to suddenly fall off the render, and Ruby realized what was about to happen once the blades emerged from its mangled form. She struggled for the gun. It was all she had left. She couldn't save Charlie, couldn't go back home and make amends with her folks for leaving. Charlie's songs were pointless. Caesar's foolish plans were simply that, foolish. Such was the hope that any of them had. The features seemed to become more visible in the creature's face. Their still working eyes aligned with anticipation, and their mouths formed a grin. The more details the growing light gave, the more Ruby desperately fumbled for the only relief that she could fathom. It was the fulcrum of madness that invoked a scream, loud, echoing, the sounds of either triumph or hatred that Ruby thought had come from the render. She found out otherwise as the flaming form of Charlie collided with the creature, and the 2 of them tumbled to the ground. Without hesitation, Ruby picked herself up as best she could, momentarily noticing that her left foot was broken. She reached and pulled the gun from her pocket and nodded over to where Charlie struggled with the render. His body was steaming in the rain. She fell to her knees and shoved Charlie off the thing before it could start to dismember him, then placed the barrel against its heads and fired. The explosion of its filth covered Ruby, and the stink of it caused her to vomit. Its body wriggled comically, but after a few moments, the thing was dead. Ruby wanted to check on Charlie, but first she awkwardly dragged the render's wretched carcass over to the burning remains of the vehicle. When she'd returned to Charlie, he was face down, just as she had found him at the hotel. And once again, she was crying. The night was nearly upon them, and though the rain was letting up, they were in bad shape. Ruby collapsed on her right side next to him, gently pressing his arms, wanting to turn him over and see how badly he was hurt. Charlie complied with her wish and looked into her eyes. His eyebrows were singed, his face was caked with so much dirt and blood that it made Ruby start to laugh. They lay together in the dim light, the air very clear. Through a void of nothingness, Charlie could see a light in the distance, like a blue twinkling star. The soles of his feet felt no earth, yet his steps brought him closer and closer to it. There was no sound at first, not even his breathing, and he was breathing. How was he even walking without pain? What did it really matter? This empty dark was a relief compared to where he was going, even if he was laying next to Ruby, hearing her laugh. There was nothing now, no fear, no concern for himself or anything else. Nothing, and nothing was better than what little something his life had amounted to. He was neither cold nor hot, comfortable or strained, calm or afraid. He was as much nothing as the world was around him. Yet that light was something. It was neither interesting nor mundane, lovely or abhorrent, but he kept moving towards it with a stride that seemed not entirely his will. Had he a will, he wouldn't know it. He was pointless, worthless, yet he and the distant light were the only two things existing on this plane. Why not continue on? Said a faint thought. Why not? Charlie agreed aloud. It's not like I have anything better to do. His voice wasn't his harsh, gravelly replacement, the one they had so graciously given him. What were they anyway? It didn't matter. Neither was his voice the one that he had sang with. Who was that again? It didn't matter either, he supposed. All voices heard here were no louder than thought, and they seemed to fade out of memory as though they had never been spoken. The light went from the size of a pin to a speck, to a dot, to a pupil of someone with silver eyes. There was something akin to a breeze, or the sensation of a breeze, or the idea of a breeze, he supposed. May have been the sound of water, a whisper, a taste of saliva in his mouth. The light was the size of a marble now, like what he'd used to play with Frankie at the end of Henpin Street. With that memory came a laugh. He was a boy, back against the wall of bones and mortar, cigarette in his mouth. The street was a beating heart. The cars were cells running to and fro, while he stood idle, waiting his turn to flick the black sphere into the crowd and scatter them abroad. He'd win this bet. He knew all the tricks. He would get that kiss from Ruby. The light was now a basketball, swishing through the net of tangled hair. Cheap. Ellisboro really had a lousy court. You would have thought that a town built around one of the most prominent processing plants in the country could afford a better goal. So cheap, yet the kids devotedly played every weekend. Sometimes the parents would watch, faceless, hairless forms, sitting quietly in the stands while Caesar kissed Ruby beneath the south side goal. Charlie sauntered over to her parents and sat in between them, their mangled arms embracing him around the shoulders. It's all right, kid. We understand. The light was now his mother's swollen belly, pregnant again. They had to pay their debt somehow. If only the Latchers were just a little more patient. Oh yeah, that's what they were called. With that thought, Charlie's next step landed in cold liquid. Clear, pure. He stopped and looked down to see a form writhing about beneath the ripples. He watched as the liquid calmed, and he could see a young face. His face. What was he doing down there? He reached down towards himself, and likewise, his image reached up, and their hands clasped together in the cold pool. Charlie pulled his image, and it came up to meet him. "Thanks, man," the other Charlie said. His raspy words were loud and echoey, as if they came from the light. "Thought I'd never get out of there. Phew, my limbs are freezing, especially my foot." "About that," responded the dry Charlie, his words a faint, lovely whisper, an aspect of better things, or at least the idea of better things. Yeah, I know. You went and sliced it off. Hey, man, at least you put it to good use, right?" "Right," dry Charlie said, feeling saddened by the jest. It wasn't as though he wanted to do this to his counterpart, but what other choice did he have? Marlowe was a good guy. He knew how to fix someone up that was short on plaz. Wet Charlie was indeed low on plaz, low on luck, low on cigarettes, low on love, full of heartache. "About that," Wet Charlie croaked. "Yeah, I know. Caesar was Ruby's man, not us. She was just an invitation to heartbreak, man. I'm sorry I dragged you into it." "Don't mention it. It's just as much my fault as yours. More so mine. After all, I've got the wealth, not you. No offense, but that's not what I was gonna say." The light was now the size of a dartboard. Caesar's aim was off. A double followed by two off the board. "I want to marry her, Charlie," mumbled Caesar through the pain of his pulled teeth, "but she doesn't want to leave town." Charlie scoffed at his opponent's turn as he readied his own. "Well, who would with you?" he said, feeling bad for the response. He wondered if he was simply mocking his friend's lack of game, or his predicament with Ruby's stubbornness. Either way, Caesar was out of luck. He'd be processed tomorrow. "What were you gonna say?" asked dry Charlie, now shivering from the ice water on his feet as they submerged in. The light was the size of the clock that was set in the bone archway of the bus station's entrance. The latchers were dead. Charlie, soaked in their filth, waited nervously for any bus out of Ellisboro. He blended in with those getting off their shift at the plant. That is, until he felt two arms curl around his side. "It's all right, kid. We understand." No, they wouldn't have understood. How could Charlie have told them that Ruby's eyes were taken, that despite everything they had given to ensure otherwise, they had failed? They'd have to go home and watch their baby cry with those black marbles, knowing that it was all for nothing. He had to run. He had to steal a car and go. It was the best thing for Charlie, Ruby, and them when he was gone. The law would be after him, and they could get relief for a while, now that their debt collectors were out of the picture. Would there be more? Sure, but just a little relief is better than nothing at all. A little relief is something. I was gonna say that we are that little something, Charlie. The light was now a cloudless sky that hung above the two Charlies, who stood in the middle of a rippling mirror. "Let me show you," rasped the wet Charlie. There was the sound of a siren, red and blue lights, a street rushing by around him, an undulating form in the distance, now taking the place of the light, growing closer and closer, but not fast enough. Never fast enough. There were people sopping up the puddles of Caesar's blood, wringing it out into buckets, bottles, cans. They would want more. Ruby had to stop them. The ambulance roared as it sped towards the crowd. Janice, her partner, was screaming in her ears, trying to stop her. Ruby kept on, gnashing the inside of her mouth, tasting her own blood. The crowd disappeared only when it was nearly too late. Ruby heard screams all around her as she knelt down by the lifeless form of Caesar. She wanted to roll him on his back and begin chest palpitations, but she knew he was too broken to be moved by anything like that. She got up and ran to the back doors of the ambulance and began pulling out the stretcher, calling her partner to help her. Ruby could hear the crowd gathering around her, mumbling to themselves whether or not they should just rush the paramedics and take the plas that they had. Ruby called out for Janice again as the stretcher came crashing onto the pavement, but she never came around to help her. After a few minutes, Ruby rounded back where Caesar lay, only to find Janice herself filling up one of the collection bags for lost causes. The crowd also began to rush forward in a tumultuous cry of greed, and Ruby tried to run out in front of them, but was knocked aside. Her face busted against the concrete several times as the people trampled her. Those not close enough to Caesar stood around her, as well as on her. In her rage, Ruby reached up and began to bite down on the heel of a large man pressing down on her wrist. A sudden kick took her out of the world, though. "It's amazing," Wet Charlie said. "The little town she loves so much couldn't have cared less for her when it came down to it." Dry Charlie shook his head. They were desperate. "True, but what made them that way?" "I didn't make this world, and I suppose you didn't either." Wet Charlie pulled a damp cigarette out of his pocket. "Got a light?" Dry Charlie pulled out a box of matches. "Ain't gonna do you any good." "Yeah, well, it's a thought that counts, am I right?" "No. Any thoughts of helping didn't save Caesar," said Dry Charlie, lighting a match. To Dry Charlie's surprise, Wet Charlie began to draw on a mouthful of nicotine, then blew out in his counterpart's face. "And if you were there, would you have done more than think to help yourself to your old friend?" Dry Charlie exhaled into his trembling hands. "I hope I would have, but I wasn't there." "You're right," snarled Wet Charlie through his teeth. "You weren't there, but I was." Ruby slowly came into the back of the ambulance. The side of her face was wet where her tears had soaked the head of the stretcher. The doors were still open. Night had fallen. A voice hummed softly in her subconscious, and she felt strength in her limbs again. No one was there for her, not even Janice. She was alone in the night, yet there was no fear. There was nothing. Ruby felt a complete numbness as she exited the back of the ambulance and went to where she had found Caesar. The body was gone. Only little remnants of dried blood remained. She turned to go back to the ambulance and drove back to the hospital. She was told when she got there that the people had begun to get violent with one another over the corpse of Caesar, and that the Latchers were called in. Janice was dead, along with many of the crowd. Caesar's corpse had been taken to be processed, and no one was able to keep the blood. Ruby was numb to all of it. She felt neither anger nor sadness. She felt as though she were drifting through a dream, her feet feeling no earth, yet her steps carrying her somewhere. Wet Charlie was smirking to himself as the vision played out. They saw Ruby Brennan tell her parents about what had happened to Caesar, saw Charlie Valentine at her door, leading her to the ring that he had made, saw the Latchers at her door, there to take her eyes, claiming her parents' blood debt for Ruby's tuition was not being met, and they had nothing else to give. "I know all of this," whispered Dry Charlie. "You didn't see it. You ran away from it," Wet Charlie breathed in another draw, then exhaled a pure white cloud, followed by words in a voice as still as the trickle of blood. "You need to see it, Charlie. It's my favorite part." Ruby lay in agony as the tears mingled with fresh blood seeping out of her sockets. It was the first pain that she had felt since Caesar's death. It all seemed to collide at once. She felt her heart break at the thought of her not being able to hold him again, kiss his lips, break his heart. She wasn't going to leave town with him. She had too much that she loved here. Her parents, her job, her school, her friends. She wanted to pay back everything she owed, not just run away from her obligations. The taking of her eyes was the beginning of that responsibility being met, and she could live with it. It was Charlie's voice being taken that she could not. He was always looking out for her, singing for her, writing songs about her. Now he was a criminal. Ruby heard his voice from one of the latchers that came to collect her eyes, and she knew what had happened, what he had tried to do. Charlie Valentine loved her, and now, being honest with himself, Ruby Brennan realized she loved him as well. She supposed that she always had, though she wanted more than a song. She got it. Charlie gave up what was seemingly prized most about his character, and was now alone to face the wrath of the processors. Ruby realized what she wanted, realized it when she looked upon her parents' mangled forms, holding each other close, sobbing over their daughter. No more. The burden would no longer be theirs. She'd find Charlie. If they had to share the same fate, so be it. That night, she would head out on her own run-down motorcycle, which was hopefully in decent enough shape to catch up with Charlie, and by some miracle, it had been. Wet Charlie flicked away the butt of his cigarette, which created a ripple where it fell. As the effect grew in size, there came a rumbling beneath. Dry Charlie was shivering violently as the water began to lap at his legs. So cold. He never thought he could be so cold. In response, his doppelganger began to chuckle a little, slapping Dry Charlie's arm hard like Caesar used to. So that leads us to this point, my friend. You are Ruby's little something in this world of nothing. I'm anxious to see how the two of you fare. Really, I do. Dry Charlie felt himself fall to his knees, the cold water splashing up onto his body, chilling him even more. Only one more thing I wanted to tell you before I go, Wet Charlie said, looking down at Dry Charlie. Only now he wasn't Charlie at all. He was Caesar. He was Ruby. Now his mother and father. He had no form anymore, just a light that Charlie could no longer bear to look at. Nor could he tell if it was the voice of the speaker or if it was the cold water engulfing him. Endure. Charlie woke with a scream as hands grabbed at him, forcing him down onto a cold table. He's alive, Marlowe. This guy's alive. The room was a sweltering vessel, and its rhythmic pulsations defeated Ruby to all conscious thought. She lay in a fetal position in the corner farthest from the door, her wide eyes fixed on it, awaiting her promised visitor. Charlie was dead. His body would be processed. As she lay here, buffeted by a wall and floor and unable to rest, she tried to imagine what they might make from the man she had loved. Perhaps his bones and muscles would make up the main components of a piano. That would be fitting. His skin made into paper to write songs on. Cigars from his fingers, perhaps. Maybe his other foot would make another gun. It had worked well the first time, despite Marlowe's sabotage. So many assurances the weapons dealer gave as he and his crew loaded them into the van after finding them beside the wreckage. Looking back at it now, she could see their desperation to make amends for their contribution to her and Charlie's crimes. Their fake smiles oblivious as she shuddered in the rain as Charlie lay oblivious to the world. She wished she could have kept him alive. Just a few more minutes to look into his eyes, to tell him that she loved him. When Marlowe's boys started to reach for them, she clung to him tightly, refusing to be separated from him, like she was from. The shifting air now became even more unbearable as the smoker molded himself from the wall. His suit was covered by the freshly disgusted wetness of the muscles seeping moisture. He grinned at Ruby as he pulled a cigar from his coat pocket. Ruby held herself tightly as the hopelessness took hold, and he lit up. "Well, sweetheart, was it worth it?" All in vain. Everything. The vision of Charlie being carried away, only to have Marlowe later regretfully tell her that he had succumbed to his wounds. When she insisted on seeing the body, Marlowe had his men seize hold of her and bring her to this ever-beating tumor that was her cell. There were things that she saw when she was being drugged through the warehouse, things that Marlowe procured at the base of his operations. A walkway that arched above a mess of teeth, hair, and ever-bleeding flesh, tendrils reaching out of cylinders full of precious blood. In return, men in safety gear were allowed small pieces of the cancer that would separate from the mass by handfuls. Yep, that's the source of it, Ruby. It's where we come from. It's what all of you are being fed to. Your plasma at least, but in your case, baby, I think we're gonna make an exception. The smoker approached her with Caesar's mock pity, his squelching steps unhalted despite the floor's refusal for stillness. When he was before her, he squatted down to force eye contact, while taking a dreaded inhale from the cigar. Ruby's eyes filled with tears as she tried to brace herself against the fumes. He blew a cloud, black as her eyes, then lightening to a dull gray, then to white. When it cleared, Ruby was no longer looking into the face of her old lover, but upon a valley of charred black stones. Numberless beasts, goats, bulls, cattle, pigeons, doves, ravens, all strewn about, cut open with their life's blood, slowly forming an ocean which filled the valley, a cacophony rising as people plunged themselves into the crimson water to drown. Above the calamity, the sky remained dark, cloud-like smoke billowing from a great furnace. Ruby turned around to see herself amongst the multitude of pure human forms, all whole and unmolested. Yet they all wept in bemoaning agony. Ruby began to tremble at their misery, for she knew it must be founded in truth that pertained to her as well. A sharp chill ran through her as men and women passed by her to join the rest of those who perished in the valley of blood. Old and young, beautiful and ugly, solitary or holding hands in groups of families, dragging their children along with no concern for their distress. The clouds remained dark, and Ruby felt hopeless. Hopeless as all these people. A compulsion was building up inside her to turn towards the crowd. What other choice was there? What did it matter if she carried on? Charlie was dead. Caesar too. Her parents would likely be killed for her transgressions as well. The world was a creation of malign intent, and humanity's purpose was to simply fuel it with its demise. Suddenly there was a voice, powerful and in tune to an ancient melody of a forever lost land. The throng of hopeless souls halted their willful demise and headed to the speaker, to whom Ruby now beheld. Whether the naked form was a male or female, Ruby could not tell. She only knew that it was beautiful, and that the deepest lust began to burn within her. To experience the flesh of this being in whatever way possible was the purest physical sense that she would strive for. It was the only thing that mattered. When it spoke again, she began to feel the crowd move towards the voice, pushing her forward as well. The excitement of getting close to this being, of touching those close to her, the joys of flesh, sin unfactored. She heard herself laughing, weeping, moaning. All was not lost. Pleasure still remained, so life remained. What more did they need? What human being needs a God who abandons them, tells them that they are unworthy of salvation, that they are only worth their own flesh and blood? The being understood all too well these feelings, and there was only one outcome: supplication and devotion to the endless pleasures of the flesh. The crowd began to merge together in an ecstasy of endless sensual experience. Nothing was forbidden, not anymore. There was no one to judge. Ruby was about to join in when a shudder passed through her heart, a burning sensation that kept her still while the degradation occurred around her. Her lustful feelings were still present, but this burning was too much to override. The being was speaking, singing, while its servants obeyed vigilantly, until it suddenly caught sight of Ruby's stillness. It began to approach her, its beautiful limbs shimmering even in the blackened overcast. The lust had become unbearable, yet the flame in her heart kept her from acting upon it. However, when it was before her, Ruby realized she was in the presence of a hairless mass of pitiful proportions. This was neither male or female, neither was it human. It was a void mockery of power, a loud voice and an illusion of beauty. The lust was completely left, and the burning had become a comfortable warmth. "Will you not partake in my joy?" the thing asked Ruby. Its voice was pathetically weak and frail. The fact that it had such an impact previously was farcical to her. She looked around to find that the sights of fleshly pleasure that herself wanted to accept now disgusted her. By this point, the violence had begun. The entrails were being passed around amongst the orgies, and the stench of emptied bowels made Ruby want to vomit. The thing's face had become a childish grimace, and all at once, Ruby Brennan came to the realization that the reality she had been living in was formed in the image of this outcast, whose glory was a shameless imitation of the one who had given its power long before. It led people to prosperity, as long as they were fit to defile themselves, to act against their own nature. Life progressed and technology increased, allowing for new ways to experience methods of fleshly excess. Centuries upon centuries of a base obsession, to the point where the entire aspect of the human form became the lead source of architecture and currency. Ruby also saw the mound of tumorous amalgamations of hair and teeth and eyes. The latchers and the renders were merely the underlings that were condemned alongside this thing, who basically took possession of the abominable cancerous masses fueled by human plasma. Caesar died because of this thing. Ruby's mother and father gave up their bodies to keep it as far away from her as possible. Marlowe made a faulty firearm for Charlie on behalf of this cancer. The smoke cleared as the door opened. Marlowe stepped inside, void of any facade or courtesy. He and two of his men approached Ruby, pulling her violently to her feet. A question was running through her mind. "They want you, Ruby," said Marlowe with a sneer. Why did Charlie's foot work? All of you. She was led out into the walkway, where she could see the mass below. The workers were no longer feeding blood to it. Ruby knew what was in store for her, and now she knew who was behind all of it, she supposed. But why had she made it this far? What encouraged her to leave home and find Charlie? To not deliver him up to the renders to save herself? To love Charlie? To love at all? If there was no hope, as was presented by the smoker, why was the burning comfort still in her heart? They began to go down the stairs. Ruby could already see the tendrils reaching for her, but she was calm. "Marlowe!" A scream was heard in the distance as a man came running to the guardrail of the platform. Ruby felt her bottom lip begin to quiver strangely. "Marlowe! This guy's alive!" A jolt hit Ruby's body. The burning filled her chest as she halted her steps, causing the two men to reach for her arms and violently try to move her along. They couldn't. Then, without any effort it seemed, Ruby pulled herself free from the man on her right and grabbed the man on the left's pistol from his holster. They were dead before Marlowe could completely turn around. Ruby fired into the deceiver's throat, then shoved him into the mound, a choking gurgle of agony, more satisfying than a scream could ever be. Shouts filled the warehouse, followed by gunfire. A quickening sent her to each audible source, and blood followed. Screams, hopelessness, remorse. They wanted the pleasure to continue on for at least one more day. No living being would be more than enough to grant them a few fleeting seconds of agony. What followed after was not allowed to enter into Ruby's mind. She heard the lullaby of her mother, a love song from Charlie in her honor, and another faint sound that still seemed to drown out the rest. It was an immaculate glorification that had been sung behind the dark clouds since before the mockery came. A true beauty that had all made it possible to ignore and spread no more acknowledgement of its existence. And Ruby believed now that a remnant had indeed been found. She was part of it, and nothing could stand between her and the love she now felt for a face unseen. Her eyes turned to the abomination. Forms were beginning to merge from it. They were devils, the nightmares that she had feared all her life pitifully stretched and elongated themselves towards her, not to harm her, but to plead. The burning comfort and joy seemed to overtake her completely. She felt something in her hand, then the scent of gasoline, and the wretched screaming of the abominations denied their physical form. When Ruby came back to herself, she was standing over the broken form of Charlie Valentine. A word came to her, in a whisper that insinuated a future of uncertainty on their part, but for the speaker, all was clear upon him. So many in this world would deny his presence, while most would remain willfully ignorant. Ruby and Charlie themselves may have moments of doubt ahead, and the others, set aside for his intended purposes, would find their own road hard. But a summation was given in a single command: endure.